Hey everyone, welcome to the Rick Richards Show. It is May 15th, 2020. I am your host, Rick Richards, and today we are going to be taking a deep dive into combat sports. And it's going to be a bit of a different deep dive. We're not going to be not so much analyzing technique or the state of the game, but more taking a cultural look and you know, kind of taking a deeper dive on the history and some of the ambient effects of the fight game, boxing, MMA, and even something further back in history. And my guest today is Walter Finn. Walter Finn is an author, a cultural observer. Is that fair to say, Walter?
Yeah, I think that's definitely fair to say. But yeah, I'm primarily a writer,
A writer,
and
primarily a writer, and Walter has some great work that I have actually seen myself. He writes comics, and he makes them interesting and entertaining. Before we get into anything, Walter, the how have you been dealing with the whole lockdown quarantine situation? Now, as a writer, is that a good thing for you?
it's turned out to be kind of a mixed blessing. I think that you and I talked about this offline at some point, where effectively you can't. I mean, we talked about it online because we're in quarantine, right? So we weren't actually personally talking about it, but um, we weren't talking about it on a recorded show. But essentially, I realized that part of my incentives for writing are built into these kind of special treats that I give myself, including, going to restaurants, nice restaurants at the end of the week, or whatever the case may be. Meeting a friend at a nice restaurant or that sort of thing. And those incentives are like removed. So you think actually the isolation would be perfect for a writer, but it's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I have it has actually been very productive in the end. But I think originally I was struggling with the fact that there was just no light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. You know, and
Well, yeah,
that is. Oh,
the
please.
for me, when this whole thing started initially, it was like it was like a crack addict, right? That's all of a sudden strapped to a bed and going through this serious case of withdrawals, right? And I had to examine a few things about myself, and I think I'm a bit of a consumerist, and I kind of live my life at like 100 miles an hour. And in that sense, I mean, business wise, it hasn't been great. I'll be honest with you. But in the other sense of just, appreciating life and just kind of re-examining how you live, that in that sense, it's been actually been really good for me.
Yeah, I think it's ultimately, I think it will be a healthy reset. I mean, of course, we can't see perfectly what the future holds, and hopefully we're out of it soon, because I think it's been a sufficient hiatus for that sort of spiritual self-examination, right? So I think we're all ready to get going again. But I can see it being especially troubling for a guy like you, because I think in a very good way, you're a guy who tackles life in a kind of a voracious manner. You live in a robust manner, and you like to interact with people and get things done and conquer the world in a way. So for people like you, it's a very frustrating time, regardless. But there's always things that you can be doing when you think it just takes a little more imagination about what you could be doing to kind of prepare yourself for your reemergence into the world, I guess, as it were, right?
Yeah. Well, and one of the things is with that UFC 249, I was so excited for this, so excited just to have some sort of live event, because they had originally scheduled UFC 249 for, I think it was either April 12th or April 18th, sometime around then, sometime around kind of like peak lockdown, right? And one by one, each venue was canceled, and then finally they were able to do it on an Indian reservation. I think is it Tachi Palace, or there's one of the there's an Indian reservation in northern.
Sounds familiar. Yeah, it sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think it's in Northern California. It's in, or I guess you're a little more politically correct than me, so you may call it an Aboriginal reservation. But anyways, there's one in Northern California that's actually held a lot of fights, and they were going to do it there, and it was all cleared because it doesn't fall under government jurisdiction. But um, the execs at, I guess, Disney, who I think, I mean, you need a scorecard to keep track of who owns what, but both ESPN and Disney kind of said, no, pump the brakes on this. And so they pushed it off, right?
Yeah, no, I think that and I really appreciated sort of Dana White's kind of defiance in the face of everyone. It seemed like he was a kind of lone figure. I mean, I have to admit that I've been getting more into MMA recently, and unlike you, I'm a kind of more recent fan. I think it's a fascinating sport. I followed boxing previously, and I liked boxing. I probably followed boxing for well over a decade. Or a little over a decade, at least I should say. But what I would say is I really appreciated the fact that he was just kind of like, it's time to reopen. Like he sort of took it upon himself, despite the fact that no one else was kind of lurching in that direction. He was like, and actually it ended up working. He actually ended up resuming the league through a kind of, his just sort of stubbornness and determination to like get back to work, as it were. He effectively achieved that. I mean, Dana White, I think is actually quite an intelligent guy. I mean, I don't think that that's a sort of disputed thing, but I think he's a very intelligent guy. He's this kind of unpretentious guy, obviously, and that's sort of the nature of his sport. But I think he's a fascinating guy who's highly intelligent, and he's pretty funny as well. Like in his interviews, I think one of the reasons I enjoy watching fighting is that I find these fighters very funny. Like they can be very funny. And one example of that is Conor McGregor, of course, is like he's both kind of a jester and this fighter. And a lot of it has to do with the bragging about how they're going to like beat an opponent or whatever. And it's so audacious and so kind of like over the top that it's both moralizing on some level in terms of like, it's just this sort of, spice of life or something like that. They're demonstrating this sort of spirit and bravado, but it's also just kind of funny because the fighters are kind of constantly talking shit about each other, for lack of a better phrase, in a way. So it's kind of everything that the WWE isn't, and what boxing is. In other words, boxing is real. It's a real activity. It's a corrupt sport to one extent or another. WWE is not a real sport, but there is this kind of fun, like bragging that goes back and forth between these sort of, actor entertainers, athletes, certainly in their own right. And those guys absorb serious physical punishment. But I feel like the MMA makes the WWE real. Like that's my feeling. And therefore it becomes more interesting to me personally.
Yeah, I'd say the WWE, their action, the way they act, it more or less embodies the zeitgeist of the fans, right? I mean, the fans, they want to live vicariously. And have you ever been in a social situation where you're talking to somebody, or you cross paths with somebody at a bar or wherever it might be, and they're sort of pushing on you, right? Like they're starting off kind of friendly and engaging and stuff like that, but they start edging up against a boundary, and you can't tell if they're joking or if they're serious, and they're constantly kind of edging to exert a form of dominance over you. Have you ever experienced that?
Yeah, but I find it surprising that you have. Right?
Oh,
I think that yeah. Well, you it's probably because you probably hang out with some equally strong and big guys. I don't know, but
well, I've been in I've been in a lot of street fights. It would surprise people to know. You look at this face and you think, hey man, this guy's been modeling. This guy's been treated with kid gloves his whole life, right?
I would never accuse you of someone who's ever gotten in a fight before, man.
Yeah, many times. I worked at some very rough bars, and that I recognize this behavior, right? It's like, have you ever watched the film Goodfellas? Of course, right?
Yeah, it's a great film.
Yeah, and you know the scene with Joe Pesci where they're laughing. And he goes, "You're a funny guy," and like, I'm a clown. I amuse you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's one of the best scenes of all time. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a frequently referenced and quoted. So that's no great revelation on my part, but it's just a great scene.
It's an iconic scene, right?
Yeah.
And it's actually very true to life, because you come across a lot of characters that aren't, not particularly intelligent, I guess, but I mean, they are cunning, right? They have a sort of a street kind of cunning. And you see it in these fighters a lot too, right? Like where they're constantly seeing how far they can exert themselves over you, right? And I used to work in a lot of seedy dive bars, and you get this type all the time, right? And sometimes they're ham-fisted and awkward about it. Whereas Conor McGregor he's very skillful at it, right? He's able to exert dominance on people, just through his direct actions, but in a way of sort of rallying the crowd around as well, to kind of humiliate people and stuff like that. Like, if did you ever see his build up to the fight with him and Jose Aldo?
Yeah, I think I remember. I don't know how close, because I think I was just starting to get into the sport at that point. So I have seen some of the clips from the press conferences.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that some of the barbs were effectively ethnic barbs. It seems like. I don't know where you're going with it, but
Well, it was a real case in psychology, because what they had done is, Conor was the challenger and Jose Aldo was the champion, the featherweight champion, 145 pounds. And Jose Aldo at the time was considered, one of the pound for pound best, probably the greatest featherweight champion in history up until that point. And what they had done is, Dana White organized a world tour, right? So it was similar to what Conor McGregor had with Floyd Mayweather. So these two, they would go to city after city after city, doing a series of press interviews, a series of sort of open venue type things, and it's a case study in how somebody can overcome somebody psychologically. Just the way that Conor McGregor over the course of this tour, he wiped out Jose Aldo. Like he was sitting behind him and grabbing him by the neck, and he stole his belt in front of him and held it up for the
yeah.
crowd, and he just humiliated him. And at the end of it, I mean, Jose Aldo was just a beaten man. He was so withdrawn and enraged. And of course, when they eventually did fight, he just came charging forward and got knocked out in, I think, 15 seconds or something like that. So
Yeah.
it really is a case study in the psychology of combat in a way.
Yeah, I mean, that fight, and I think that there was probably a different psychological dynamic at work, with the Masvidal and Ben Askren fight, right?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce the names?
Yeah, that's right. Masvidal and Askren. Yeah.
So in that fight, of course, Askren was a touted wrestler, a very good wrestler, a very good grappler, but he was knocked out immediately with this flying kick. And so I don't know if a similar there was a different psychological dynamic there, but it does seem that Masvidal was able to kind of pump himself up, at least, if not intimidate his opponent to such an extent that he was able to, execute that move. I mean, it's a slightly different scenario, but
yeah, and I mean that fight itself was pivotal in that it kind of catapulted Masvidal into superstar status and essentially put the nail in the coffin for Askren. Askren had one more fight after that, and which was kind of he was doing well, but he ended up losing it, and then he called it a career. And it's funny because he went into the UFC. I think he was undefeated, and he had been undefeated for I don't know, since his career began, obviously, for about 10 years. And then he got in and he fought Robbie Lawler, and he won the fight. But I mean, I call it a Pyrrhic victory in a sense, because he absolutely got slaughtered in this fight. He got slammed and he got punched in the face, and he managed to have the wherewithal to grab Robbie Lawler and get a controversial stoppage on a choke. But he walked out with the victory and then walked straight into that fight with Masvidal and was made into a poster.
Yeah, no, I think that's psychological in this sort of the bragging that occurs before these bouts. It does feel unique to UFC. In boxing, there is some of that, but it's not on the same level. And it does seem that Dana White and the league generally asks basically the fighters to promote themselves. So effectively one of their jobs is to create a personality and promote themselves and to become a fighter that people basically want to see fighting effectively. So there's a whole other kind of dimension to the fighter, it seems, in UFC, that's this kind of psychological dimension where they're basically calling people out. And again, it is, as you described, it's a psychological game. I mean, boxing, fighting sports have always been psychological, but it seems especially emphasized in the UFC.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, going into the UFC 249 card now, I mean, one unfortunate result from this was, of course, well, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but I mean, Gaethje won the main event, and so it's almost completely unlikely that we'll ever see Tony Ferguson versus Khabib Nurmagomedov. Ferguson is 36 years old now, and so and amazingly, this is a fight that was been scheduled and canceled 5 times. Like
Yeah.
I think that's unheard of for one fight, two fighters to be scheduled to fight 5 times and not actually fight.
It's a much less interesting fight now, frankly, but
Yeah.
I think it's still an interesting fight, but it's much less interesting. But yeah, so Gaethje. So now I'm kind of like more up to speed now because I have been watching a little more actively. I'm less sort of knowledgeable about the history of it, but and I did have an opportunity to watch the last to watch 249. I thought it was a stunning performance by Gaethje. He controlled the whole fight, and it seemed like Gaethje was able to. He was basically a changed fighter to the extent that I'm familiar with him, and I watched a couple of sort of pre-recorded fights of Gaethje before watching that fight. But it seemed like his style had become much more controlled, that he had become more of a disciplined fighter, and it seemed like a lot of that was the influence of his trainer. So yeah, I thought it was amazing. He beat him from the opening bell to the end, uh, and he is. I think he's a formidable. He's a contender. Effectively, he's a formidable fighter. He proved himself to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, the interesting thing with Gaethje is he's a guy that actually came in around the same time as Ben Askren did, and he was another guy who was undefeated, and he had an extremely exciting style when he first came in. I mean, he used to just walk forward and trade punches with somebody until somebody fell, and up until recently, he debuted against Michael Johnson and of course knocked him out. But then he fought Eddie Alvarez, who was a former champion, and Dustin Poirier, who is also who's fought for the championship in that division. And he just couldn't do that anymore. He was just fighting guys that were better defensively. So you know what? He was just taking too much abuse, and he ended up losing back-to-back fights. And after he lost the first one, he kind of said, you know what? This is my style. I like it. I like to fight. I think it's fun. I'm going to keep on fighting this way. And then he lost the second fight, and I think that really he had a come to Apollo moment, let's call it, where he decided to rethink what was he really doing and why was he in there, right? Because I mean, that kind of style eventually it's going to catch up to you. And he has the benefit. He trains out of Grudge Gym in Colorado with Trevor Whitman, who I've met before. Trevor Whitman is a striking coach, and he's coached some of the best strikers in MMA. Shane Carwin, Brendan Schaub was a pretty good striker for a heavyweight. Nate Marquardt. So a few of them have gone through there. And Gaethje has he's become more patient. Gaethje is an excellent wrestler. This is something very few people know, but he is an excellent wrestler. But he, much in the way that Chuck Liddell did, he uses his wrestling just to keep the fight on the feet. He wants to stand and he wants to trade. Dan Henderson's another guy that kind of like that. And they want to keep it on the feet and they want to just slug it out. So he uses his wrestling essentially defensively. But you could hear, as somebody that does follow boxing, you could probably hear some of the advice that Trevor Whitman was giving to Gaethje in his corner, right?
Yeah, no, one of the best bits of advice I thought, or I just thought it was a great a great soundbite was take 10% off your punches, right? Because he didn't want him to punch himself out. And he also didn't want him to kind of maybe overcommit and expose himself to counter punching, but just to kind of take his time and to pick apart Ferguson. So I think it was just as many people have said, he put on a clinic effectively against Ferguson. But I think you're right. I was aware of the fact that he was a wrestling champion. So at the collegiate level, at least, yeah. And sort of a national collegiate wrestling champion. So he's an excellent wrestler. So yeah, I think that the fact that he's honed his striking skills to such an extent, I mean, you have to consider him a pretty complete fighter. I mean, I don't know how recently though, because again, I'm not as familiar with his history as a fighter, but I don't know how recently his grappling skills have kind of been tested, because he does like to stand and he does like to trade punches. But you have to assume that this is what he grew up doing effectively. And I've heard in interviews that he's been wrestling since he was 8 years old or however old, right? So he seems like a pretty complete fighter. It's pretty surprising. I mentioned to you before that he's one of these guys that seems like he has a kind of slower biorhythm, right? And yeah. you said what you said more simply. Well, he may not be the brightest bulb in the box. And that's probably true too, but he does seem like a guy who, as compared to Ferguson, for example, Ferguson seems like a guy who is got a lot of sort of kinetic energy, and he's a kind of more neurotic,
like Conor McGregor, right?
And Conor McGregor would be another example, but they just have a sort of a kind of sped up biorhythm, as it were. Whereas Gaethje seems a little more sort of lion-esque in the sense that he's powerful, but he's not a kind of jittery fighter, and he's just kind of. I was impressed. I mean, because again, I thought that he was kind of a wild fighter. That was my impression going in, that he was more of a wild fighter who would swing for the fences and would knock people out in spectacular manner, but would also occasionally also get knocked out himself. And that's kind of how he sort of describes his style as well, is that someone's going to go down in these sort of early rounds, and it's going to be a trading of these sort of like, terrific blows effectively. But he controlled that, and his trainer in an interview, because one thing, the sport is like an incredibly well promoted sport. I think that they do an awesome job promoting the sport. And again, I say that as a new fan. I get sucked in though, and I started watching the YouTube promotional videos. I was completely indoctrinated, and it's like, this is the best thing I've ever seen, right? And so it has that. In one of the videos, they have a interview with his trainer, and it basically, the trainer says, well, you've become one of the most exciting fighters in the sport. What do you want now? And Gaethje was like, I want to be a champ. And so they made an adjustment effectively. I mean, I think that they would have made that adjustment anyways, because obviously the goal is always to be the champ.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sets up a real interesting quartet now, because at the top of the division, you have Khabib Nurmagomedov, you have now Justin Gaethje, you have Conor McGregor, and you have Tony Ferguson. And of the three non-champions, I think that Tony Ferguson is still has the best shot of beating Khabib because of his style. Tony Ferguson is a threat to Khabib in Khabib's strongest position. So Khabib is a real kind of just a mauler, right? Like his wrestling is second to none. He's another guy that's been doing it since he was 5 or 6 years old. You can search video of him wrestling bears when he was, I don't know, 6 years old, believe it or not.
Famously, yeah, I have seen that.
But yeah, his strongest position is on top, and Tony Ferguson is a threat on top, whereas Justin Gaethje would not be, and neither obviously is Conor McGregor. So, I mean, Ferguson I would think is still the best matchup for Khabib. I don't think Justin's, I don't know if Justin's wrestling is good enough, and so far nobody's wrestling has been good enough to stall Khabib. Justin's might be. But I think Conor is a tough matchup for Justin, because Justin Gaethje doesn't like to wrestle, even though he has wrestling. And I think the accuracy of Conor's striking and his reach and his style just lends itself to catching Gaethje. Gaethje was shown that, if he is caught on the button, he'll go down, right? He's got a good chin, but he doesn't have an infallible chin. And he was almost knocked out at the end of the second round there. So it's an interesting quartet we have right now at the top of the lightweight division.
Yeah. No, and I think probably maybe even secret, though I think, Conor wants his revenge, but I think that I don't know how disappointed Conor would be if Gaethje somehow was able to win against Khabib, because I think that, as you say, I think that Conor could beat Gaethje. It seems, right?
Yeah, I think so. Because Gaethje would wander into Conor's strength, right? And we'd have to consider striking a strength of Gaethje as well, right? He clearly outstruck Tony Ferguson. So, and he's got a great coach. So, we know that's his strength as well. But Conor's sort of next level in that respect, I think.
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about the game is it does feel like, in contrast to boxing, it does feel like the fighters are using kind of every means at their disposal to defeat their opponent. And that's ultimately the thing that's addictive about this sport, is because it's not like any other sport. You could say, if you get beat in ice hockey, or you get beat, or let's limit it to, kind of the one-on-one sports, you get beat in tennis, you're only beaten by a person who's using a kind of particular skill. So they're only kind of beating you in one sort of, a kind of finely crafted, highly acquired specific skill. But in MMA, it's literally two men dominating one another by any means possible, effectively, or it's as close to that. It's as close to that as we can find in the sports world, it seems. And I think that that's the kind of fascinating aspect of it. It's kind of the rawest sport in that regard.
Yeah, no, for sure it is. And that's why it's so hard for fighters to be undefeated, just because there's so many more ways to lose, right? Was there any other fights on the main card that captured your attention?
I was mostly focused on that fight. I guess the co-main was also an interesting fight. I don't. I think it was a good card. I think in general they did set up a good card, and it had everything. It had both the sort of drawn out, clinic that Gaethje put on, but then it also had some fights that ended very quickly, that were also kind of interesting in of themselves. That's also kind of a fun thing to see, which is it's the kind of classic Mike Tyson fight where like a guy is basically knocked out in one round. Somehow you still feel like you got your money's worth, because you just saw someone completely physically dominate another person. And it's sort of like in a film where you see the samurai master come out onto the field, right? And another samurai guy attacks him and he's immediately felled with one strike, right? There's something kind of badass about that. Like there's something sort of rewarding about that as well, in a way that's different from the way the Gaethje fight was rewarding, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's, you'll have to remind me of some of the names, frankly, but the first fight, there was the ex-NFL fighter.
Oh,
It was a heavyweight fight. What's that?
Greg Hardy.
Yeah, Hardy. And his opponent, what's the name of the opponent again?
DeCastro, I believe his name was.
Yeah, so DeCastro, and I think that was fascinating about that fight is DeCastro was kind of, and it's kind of a truism in fighting sports in general and boxing as well, is DeCastro doesn't have like this sort of Adonis-like body, but he was like a skilled fighter. And in my mind, he was more skilled than Hardy. He was just a more skilled fighter than Hardy. But Hardy was just kind of physically larger and was able to kind of defeat him through his sort of physical attributes, both being larger, more powerful, and so forth. But DeCastro stayed in the fight based on a kind of superior pugilistic talent, as it were. And it reminded me also of Anthony Joshua's recent loss, right, to the Mexican fighter there. Yeah.
Ruiz, right? Andy Ruiz.
Yeah, Ruiz. So Ruiz is also a guy. The guy is this completely physically malformed, like pudgy, fat guy that you would never imagine to be a great boxer, but he is actually a very skilled boxer. So there is this kind of skill element that you can't necessarily see in the physique of boxers, which I think is sometimes a fascinating thing to see. I mean, it only really occurs in the heavyweight division when you basically can be any weight,
Yeah.
right?
You know what? I mean, these guys though, they really do themselves a disservice. Like, I mean, if you're going to go through all the effort, why not just lose some fat, right? I mean,
Sure.
it's not impossible to do. I mean, you're never going to be you're never going to be a box office sensation as long as you look like the Pillsbury Doughboy, right?
No, I agree, but I think in some you have to at some point when Ruiz is going to face Anthony Joshua, and some part of his game is based on having a certain amount of literally weight behind his shot, like physical power. Then maybe it is a good strategy to eat a couple more hamburgers before the fight, just so you have a little more weight behind your shots. I mean that, right?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If you look at boxing, right? We look at that fight. And now they're set up for a trilogy. We look at Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, and we look at MMA. It's we're almost in a golden age of combat sports right now, which is,
Sure, I would agree
and
with that.
yeah, and it's funny because I was talking to my son a couple weeks ago. I don't know the I went to I went to elementary and high school in the like the 80s, and back then there would be fights all the time. Was that the case when you were a kid as well? Maybe not
Oh yeah,
all the
yeah,
time. Maybe
yeah,
once every
of
couple of
course,
weeks.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
well,
Sorry.
basically, yeah. Anyways, continue with
Well,
your.
I was just going to say, I talk to kids now, and there's almost never fights. So there's really been there's really been a massive purge in our society against any kind of physical altercation, right? And so, I mean, do you think it's related? Um, do you think that there's a resurgence in combat sports as kind of an outlet when it seems so suppressed in society at large, or do you think it's not related at all?
Yeah, no. I think there are a couple of things going on. I mean, one of the reasons that boxing declined in popularity, it seems, is because basically the champions were no longer American champions. I mean, there was a whole decade period when the Klitschko brothers were basically dominating the sport, and Tyson and even Lewis, to a lesser extent, were household names. Everyone knows who Mike Tyson is. Every sort of layman knows who Mike Tyson is. If you go out on the street and ask someone randomly who Vladimir Klitschko is, I think it would actually be a somewhat tiny minority of people who would know who that is. Amazingly enough, even though he's been the heavyweight, maybe less so in your world where you probably deal with guys, physical. You probably deal with athletes on a kind of more regular basis than I do, but so he might be more well known in your world. But I think in the general sort of layman world, these guys are virtually unknown. I think they're more well known in Europe. I should make that distinction. In America, they basically were the Klitschko's were not really promoted in any kind of fashion, and the sport of boxing itself was not really promoted for a period that was lasted over a decade. The sport was no longer promoted in America, and the reason was because they had foreign champs effectively. You
Well,
know,
yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because there's a few. I was thinking about a few different things with this. If we look at the recent fight that between Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder, and I'll share something. Uh, there was, I wasn't aware of this actually at the time, but there was a tremendous amount of pressure on Deontay Wilder because the fight was in February, which is Black History Month, and this had not even really occurred to me at the time. Um, but the people really turned on him when he lost that fight, Black people especially. And I started thinking about the degree to which fighters are almost an avatar for the public, right? And um, I remember. Do you remember Jerry Cooney? You're on
yeah,
mute.
he was like the sort of definitive white hope, as it were, right?
Yeah, that's when I first became aware of that. That's around the time as a kid I started watching boxing, and Jerry Cooney was made up as this big white hope, a title that he didn't even want. Um, and then and it was such a big deal at the time. Um, and then, like you say, these guys, the Klitschko's, come by and they're virtually unbeatable. You know, Vitaly Klitschko was on the verge of beating Lennox Lewis, and the fight got stopped because of a cut. And he had a rematch clause, which Lewis ducked out of, or retired. It might not be fair to say he ducked out of it, but either way. But I heard nothing about it then, right? And it seems like in the space of the 30 years, now Deontay Wilder has become a kind of great black hope. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, the term white hope, at least as it would develop, I mean, I think it's an earlier term, and it might have even been a term. I'm not, my history, my knowledge of this history is not precise, but it might even have been a term like people like, Jack London was using when watching sports and stuff like that. Um, but I think that term, we understand that term now as a kind of pejorative term. Like, in other words, the idea that you or I would even root for a white hope is kind of, it seems like it would be a sort of a kind of bad or kind of immoral thing for us to do, because instead we should just be rooting for athletes more generally instead of, rooting for avatars, as you say. Um, but the irony is that during that whole Klitschko period, effectively, I mean, there could be no greater white hopes, as it were, than the Klitschkos, right? But
Yeah.
this essentially was, at least from American TV, they had the fights on HBO and stuff like that, but boxing became a kind of obscure sport in America during that period. And, but you would think that people would promote it because those guys represent white hope. So in other words, if that phenomena of white hopes is a real phenomena, which I think it is, then you think that they would be promoting the Klitschkos, right? But in other words, there might have been some, whether kind of conscious or unconscious, desire not to have these sort of white hopes dominating the sport of boxing, of
Well,
international boxing.
I actually think it's kind of insulting that even that they use that term, right? I mean, if you look at Khabib Nurmagomedov, he's massive. He became a huge megastar, particularly with Muslims around the world, right? And that's fine with me. I really don't have an issue with that. But it's fairly obvious, I guess, on the surface, that Muslims around the world are going to identify with him and make him their avatar or their champion, so to speak, right? So I think that's just a natural part of the human condition.
Yeah, no, 100. I mean, it is. I mean, it's a kind of thing that people don't like to talk about, um, for all the kind of obvious reasons that we're aware of. But I think I think it's a sort of kind of natural thing in the following sense. I mean, if you imagine that, a child watching a television show or watching a sporting event, whether live or on TV or whatever the case may be, um, to a certain extent, if they see someone who's similar to them, even if by degrees, um, that becomes a kind of reflection of them. It becomes a kind of mirror, right? So, in other words, they're watching a mirror. They're watching themselves in a kind of athletic contest or in a drama on a TV show or a film. They're seeing themselves in that role, right? Or someone who is relatively similar to themselves in that role. So, if that avatar, as it were, is successful in a boxing match or is successful in a James Bond movie or whatever the case may be, they they would naturally experience a kind of euphoria in the sense that they are that seeing themselves also being successful. They are being moralized by that depiction, right? I mean, it seems that I'm putting it in this kind of I mean, it's such an obvious thing that it doesn't feel like, I mean, I'm happy to kind of explain it, but it's such an obvious thing that it seems like it doesn't even require an explanation, as it were, right?
Yeah, no, it is. That's it. It's one of those things that, it really kind of goes without saying. People just more or less accept it. But one of the things I find interesting is that identity, both identity as in your ethnicity or your race, and kind of the primal nature of fighting, are so deeply ingrained that, I mean, I think in Islam, I think fighting is prohibited. Do you know if that's the case?
Many things are prohibited as far as I know.
I'm pretty
So
sure
I
it is.
wouldn't be surprised at athletics in general. I mean, you and I have a mutual Iranian friend who is, or I guess he has he grew up wrestling, right? So he competed at wrestling at some point, during his life. And wrestling is actually a kind of big sport in Iran. Now, Iran is it's Persian and it's Islamic, so it's not to describe it as it exists in a kind of composite state, as it were. So it's not, and he would be able to, and hopefully I'm not speaking, sort of blasphemy right now. Probably I am, but so these, I think Iran is actually known for its wrestlers, like on the sort of international Olympics stage, they're known for their wrestlers. So, it, but I think that strict Muslims in the Arabic states, for example, I mean, I think it's more of a thing where athletics are not seen as part of the religious tradition. Obviously, athletics are something that, to the extent they exist as part of any religious tradition, they exist as part of a Greco-Roman religious tradition, right? So they're distinct from these Abrahamic traditions, which sports are are in a kind of taking a fundamentalist view from a Christian, Islamic, or Jewish, or any Abrahamic position. The sports become a kind of take on a kind of sinful light in the sense that they're a kind of narcissism, or they're a kind of body worship, or they're a kind of form of paganism, as it were, right?
Yeah. I mean, all the monotheistic religions, as far as I know, um, if they don't, I'm kind of out of my wheelhouse here, but I mean, I don't think I don't think any of them are for it. Let's say that.
No, I don't think that they are. Now, of course, we also live in a secular society. So most athletes competing in America, for example, to the extent that they are, most of them are probably Christian. That's a sort of guess. I'm not looking at a poll here, but um, and we have the example of some people who are very Christian, like Tim Tebow, for example, right, who really wore his Christianity on his sleeve. And frequently you'll see athletes, often African American athletes, crossing themselves after they get a touchdown or achieve some success in the sport, and make some acknowledgement to God, presumably a Christian God in almost all cases. So but that is a secularization of, they're Christians participating in effectively a pagan secular activity, as it were, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You often see that. And I just thought it was interesting that it just seems to be such a primal drive that it overrides something like devout Christianity, or I don't know if Judaism has anything along those lines, but Islam as well, right?
I mean, one of the tensions actually between the Maccabees and the Greeks was the gymnasium. And the gymnasium is where there would both be, intellectual training, but also athletic training among the Greeks. And the concept there is it is a little bit of a foreign concept to us now, and I argue it couldn't be restored in sort of the same way, because one of the problems I think is that the athletes were training nude, which I don't think that we would go back to, nor do I think that we should go back to. Right? So I think that we see it through a kind of a lens, and some of these things I think you can also understand is corruptions that are occurring in Greek society, along things that are healthy, right? So you can see things that are both unhealthy and healthy occurring in Greek society. But one of the reasons the Jews had tensions with the Greeks is because they had these nude, athletic competitions that the Jews were not part of, and some of it may also have been related also to the tradition of circumcision among Jews, right? So in other words, if you're training nude, you know who's a Jew and who's not a Jew, right? So that was one aspect of it as well. But sports, from the Jewish perspective, sports became a kind of pagan or non-Jewish thing, right? And
Yeah. Yeah. Wouldn't it be fair to say that sports are pagan essentially? I mean, the entire spectacle of modern sports has a a Greco-Roman root. Would that be accurate?
Oh, that's 100% accurate, of course. And it's strange now. The term eludes me, but there was an actual fight style that was basically UFC back in the day. You remember? Yeah. So they basically the Greeks also had UFC, which you actually brought my attention to. I didn't realize they had UFC, but I knew that they had the boxing. I knew that they had the wrestling and all the Olympic sports, right? So the Olympics, the most obvious manifestation of their influence on modern sports is the Olympics, right? I mean, that term is actually derived from the ancient Greek games, where it's an effort to kind of recreate ancient Greek games. So that's the kind of most obvious manifestation of the influence that the Greeks and Greco-Roman society had on modern sports. But there are less obvious things, like, for example, NASCAR, right? So NASCAR is something that's never been interesting to me, even kind of remotely. Like, I just find the sport kind of boring. But I'm not a super car guy. I'm starting to become a little more of a car guy, so I'll probably begin to relate to, I think that when you reach a certain age, your cars become more interesting. If you were not interested in cars before, you become more interested in cars as you get older. And I think it is a kind of shallow materialistic thing, but they become more interesting. And I think that, but they had the chariot races back in the ancient world as well. And NASCAR is effectively a modern day chariot race. Mm-hmm. So every kind of form the Greeks already invented. And you drew my attention to this ancient form of UFC. So they also had developed that, right? So yeah, and I think that ultimately sports are a very healthy and good thing. We look at it's a way of kind of in the gymnasium imperfectly. I think the gymnasium imperfectly works toward this ideal of healthy mind, healthy spirit, right? This idea, and that's kind of one idea, which is like, if you're physically healthy, you're also going to be psychologically healthy. And I think that is a truism, right? When men are in good shape, they're in good physical shape, they're going to feel good about themselves. They're going to feel sexually attracted to women. They're going to they're ready to go out and conquer the world. So that the fitness aspect is there, and that's important. But it also goes to this idea of training both the mind and the body and being kind of well-rounded in a sort of Apollonian manner, right? So we have this figure of Apollo in the ancient world, who is a god of intelligence, but he's also this god who is an athlete. He's a god of athletes as well. So they have myths where he's able to beat Mars in wrestling, but he's also able to outrun Hermes, right? He's the ideal of a polymath, or a kind of well-rounded, all-American is the term that we used to use, where he's the student athlete. He's good at all things, but you could say he's the jack of all trades. But the myth suggests that he's great at everything, right? So he's the ultimate Renaissance man. But I think in the Renaissance, I think sports were less of a priority than they are now, and probably sports are too much of a priority now in some ways. But I think you understand my point is that there was an ideal that men could be both physical and intelligent, that they could be both scholars and they could be both masculine and intelligent. That ideal, I don't think exists now, or that ideal has been destroyed to one extent or another. I think it can be revived. I'm optimistic about that. But that's one thing I would remark. If you allow me to go on, because I feel like I'm hogging the mic, unless you want to respond.
No, go ahead. This is fascinating. I like hearing about it.
Yeah, I mean, so before we got on air, we talked about, I'm a writer myself, but there are these writers, these kind of particularly sort of masculine writers in American literature, who were avid boxing fans, and they're not even they're not even writers that I paid particularly close attention to, though some of them I like, and one of them I actually did through comic books, as it would turn out, did pay some fair amount of attention to, but they were these sort of kind of masculine writers in American literature. And who's the most masculine writer in American literature? probably people would say Hemingway, right?
Yeah, he's
And
one of my favorite
Hemingway,
writers.
yeah, and he wrote in a kind of simple, succinct style that was appealing to many people. His writing had a kind of popular appeal, and but apparently one of the stories about him is that he had a boxing ring in his backyard, effectively, and he would invite guests into his backyard for a little pugilism to fight a couple of rounds of boxing, right? I mean, that's the kind of guy that Hemingway was. He was also a gun guy, right? He was really into guns, and he also was a pretty heavy drinker, which adds to his macho mystique to one extent, but he's also a kind of tragic element or sort of aspect of his life. Another guy was Jack London, also a huge boxing fan, and I think that memory doesn't serve me exactly, but I think that they did have this term of white hope, and this was there was a big fight with Jack London and Jeffries that was a kind of historic. It was called the fight of the century, right? And
Oh, are
this
you
is
talking about Jack Johnson and James J. Jeffries?
yeah. What did I say?
Jack London.
Oh, Jack Johnson and Jeffries. London was the writer who was observing, this event at the time, and London was a fan of Jeffries, right? And he wanted the White Hope basically to kind of put this black guy back in his place, so to speak. So there, London was very conscious of this idea of ethnic athletes serving as avatars for their particular group. And so he's another guy, Robert E. Howard, who I sort of alluded to before, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, was also another guy who was one of these guys who loved boxing. And he also was very aware of sort of blacks moving into the sport, because the sport was becoming desegregated. And he was also a guy that was, had these sort of white hopes that he would root for. But I think he also came to admire, and I think in a good way, he came to admire some of these black athletes that were boxers. And he acknowledged that they were very skilled boxers, right?
Yeah, well, I'd say there's a very, in a sense, a very egalitarian response to boxing. I mean, no matter what somebody is, when you see heart and courage and determination and skill, you're going to respond on a very visceral level to that, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And do you think it's a coincidence that boxing sort of came, the modern renaissance of boxing sort of came about, after the Civil War and after the West had effectively been settled in the United States? Do you think that's coincidental, or do you think that is part of it, maybe?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that these sort of activities, which to some extent or another, are also recreational activities, right? Because when we're talking
Imply
about
a level of societal success, don't they?
yeah, and especially to become sort of developed or sort of highly developed, that they become these big media events, and that they become the focus of sort of civic and public attention. So yeah, a society has to have achieved a certain amount of development for people to kind of become interested in these more, what you could argue are more recreational activities. I think that sports are salubrious in the sense that they are a healthy thing. I don't think that they're healthy in all their forms. I think that they can be kind of corrupted and become a bad thing and a bad influence on society in certain forms. And I would count, for example, the NFL among those forms. Like, I think it's a kind of corrupt form. But sports in general, and part of it is about balance. I actually personally don't think I think I'm kind of Romanesque in the sense that I like the idea that we have these massive sporting events that the whole world is watching. And I don't think that there is anything inherently bad with that, right? Now, obviously, anything that people engage in a kind of a moderate way can become a vice, right? So people can become too obsessed with sports and it becomes too much of their life from a spectator point of view. I mean, obviously, professional athletes are going to be singularly obsessed with sports, as they should be. That's their profession. But from a kind of spectator point of view, I think that some people can obviously get too into sports, but people can get too much into anything, right? They can
Mhm.
get too obsessed with anything, even things that we think are relatively theoretically. Someone could be building a model train in their basement, and it could take over their life to the detriment of their marriage and their career, right? So people can get too obsessed with anything, and so I don't think that there was anything kind of inherently wrong with sports, even as a massive spectator thing. I think it's actually it can be very galvanizing for a society uh, to have the whole society fixated on these kind of these meaningful sporting events. I actually think it's a kind of good thing. Um,
Well, yeah, and you know what? At their very best, sports inspire people, don't they? They inspire them to try harder, and inspire them to overcome obstacles, right?
yeah, yeah. So what I would say though is the problem though now is that the media. The problem is that's the only thing that we have now, right? To kind of moralize people, and and again, it appears in this kind of imperfect way that often demoralizes people, right? Uh, so, but I think that what is missing is the balance of. It would also be ideal too if media played a function of uh, glorifying great scientists, for example, which is something that's completely disappeared, right?
Other than Stephen Hawking.
And look, I mean, there's also the kind of aspect of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. But I think it should actually be kind of a priority of our society. And my feeling too is that ultimately the state should have a role in media. I think that ultimately the state should have a role in media in creating effectively propaganda, but also art that is healthy for us, right? Whereas I don't think that we see that now. I think the media now is 100% mercantile and sort of out for its own, and is kind of incentivized in a way to create salacious and effectively degenerate stuff that is not valuable and useful media for us, and creates bad models for people in this sort of thing, right? So I think a society where there was a kind of paternalistic element in media production originating ultimately from the state would ultimately be a good thing. I mean, that's assuming that the state at that point is more or less a good actor. That can't be assumed now. The state now is not a good actor, right, in my personal opinion. But in an ideal society, the state would have an involvement in the production of media, and it would glorify athletes, but it would also glorify scientists, and it would take the best artists to do this. So you would have the best artists making films, maybe something closer to A Beautiful Mind. That would become a more common thing. I mean, that filmmaker actually, Ron Howard, makes some films that are actually pretty healthy films. He also made Cinderella Man. I don't know if you caught that one.
Yeah, I was familiar with that fighter actually. That was Jack Sharkey, right? Or James J. Braddock.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yep.
was
And
period
it was played by Russell Crowe was the
right.
actor in the film.
Yeah,
In fact, Russell Crowe was the actor in both films. He was both the actor in he both played Nash in Beautiful Mind, and he also played the boxer.
actually,
So
that I want to wrap this up pretty soon, but that does bring to mind one other thing. The one of the fighter, I think it was the fighter that he beat, was actually Max Baer, and he was either fully Jewish or half Jewish, and he used to show up with the Star of David on his shorts, and he was an icon in the Jewish community, of course.
yeah.
And little known trivia, his son went on to play Jethro in the Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
didn't know
No.
Jethro was Max Baer's son?
No, I did not know that. No. Holy
Yeah,
cow.
probably not many people did.
Wait, do you think it's not very common knowledge in my view? Yeah.
I used
Is
to be
it?
a fan of the Beverly Hillbillies. Yeah.
Well, yeah, one thing I would say is that film too. I think it's more latent. It's obviously more latent than it's explicit, but that film does show basically a kind of ethnic competition between two fighters.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
Cinderella Man.
Those always tend to be the biggest fights too. Let's face it, right?
Yeah.
Are there any fights that you're looking forward to in the next, I don't know, 6 months? Or do you think we're going to see the Fury Wilder rematch?
Oh yeah, 100% looking forward to that. And I mean that's more kind of my wheelhouse in terms of having knowledge about the sport. But I'm looking forward to Habib and Gaethje.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to any fight that Conor McGregor's in. he's the one who kind of drew me into the sport. I think that without, he was the gateway drug, and I think he was for a lot of people, because he's just, I would say that he's the most entertaining athlete that I've ever seen.
Yeah. You know what? If you get a chance, watch some of George St. Pierre's early fights.
I've heard that, and I've clicked a couple of, yeah.
Yeah.
He reminds me of Von Damme a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. Same accent, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, is there anything you want to plug, Walter, or any final messages?
No, I've enjoyed it.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, we could literally go on for hours and hours about this, couldn't we? It's actually,
We could. Well, maybe we'll have to do another one.
I'm all for it. Awesome. Okay. So we will leave it there. For Walter Finn, I am Rick Richards, and we will see you next.